These are my top 10 favorite authors of all time, and this is a guide on how to start reading them. I am not ashamed to confess that I spent hours pondering around this list. And before we get to see which are my favorite authors, and I bet you're going to be surprised around those that are in position number 3 and number 2, let's go to some honorable mentions, because whenever I struggle to create a list, I inevitably get into honorable mentions. And let's start with an author that has created a masterpiece in fantasy, an epic high fantasy. It is a story that is long in scope, in pages, in character depth, in epicness, and that is Robert Jordan and The Wheel of Time. I'm adding Robert Jordan in my honorable mentions because I'm just starting this series. I am currently at book 5, so perhaps not really starting, but although I'm dumbfounded and amazed on how much the author has conveyed, I know there are some points on how the arc of the characters are finished that it's what ultimately land the point. So I feel that I am really loving the writing, really loving the ability to go to different parts of this massive land and get to see a lot how the magic, it's so intricate, but I'm still finding some points that I know will make it or break it for me, so I feel it's still early, so we'll continue. It will let you know soon. Another honorable mention goes to an author that is a master and creating worlds that are incredibly unique. I don't believe that I've read stories that feel so fresh, so I am lost in this story, and her writing style, it's easy, but it's able to convey so many emotions. And the reason why she is here and not in the proper list is because I haven't read enough, I guess, in order to consolidate it. She is a queen of standalones, and I'm talking about Susanna Clarke. I absolutely loved Piranesi, and I'm also absolutely loving Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. However, I haven't finished it yet, but the ability to really create characters that are nuanced, that are lovable, and stories that are so out of this world and amazing. And I cannot recommend this author more. The next honorable mention goes to an author that is making a massive effort to trying to solve humanity. She's stitching word by word our hearts, and she is restoring faith in humanity in me. It's an author that is really working more toward this blend of fantasy and sci-fi, and she is specialized in solar punk. And this is an idea of something terrible has happened, but what it's after that, it's hope, it's wonderful stuff, and that is Becky Chambers. I read and fell in love absolutely with A Sound for the Wild Belt, and also fell in love with the second, and it's just, there's this calmness, this soft story that I really believe that we in the society need every now and then, and I think she is the queen of providing a story that feels cozy but feels transformative. Her stories always make me reflect on how things can also go good, and how even if we are all very individualistic and things appear to go downhill for society, like there might be something going there. There's a trend that might change in the future, and I love to reflect about that, so really recommend. One of the authors that was in the top 10, then out of the top 10, then in out for ages, and it is one of the points that took me most of the time to decide. It's Erin Morgenstern. She has incredible stuff such as The Night Circus, but also we have The Starless Sea, which I wasn't a fan of. So here we are then on the honorable mentions. The main things that I love about this author are the ability to craft a wonderful world building. Like the setting, it's a proper character, the vibes are off the charts, and this is a story about magic, and it is done in a way that feels magical, also transformative. I vividly remember reading this book and then wanting to go to the circus. I went to a restaurant that was inspired in circus, and I was like, oh my god, all the stuff, all the points are connecting, and it just, that is magic at its finest. I was able to see life in a different light, and that book was phenomenal. Therefore, I really believe this author has a unique ability to create worlds that feel beautiful. It is also times in which I don't understand enough, and I'm not sure. The next author has created one of my favorite series of all time, and I absolutely love the depth that she created with the characters. A world that feels unique, but really takes a lot for the ninjas and the samurais, and there's a lot of family drama, a lot of strategy, and while I was reading this story, I was completely in love. I was transported, and I was in awe about how good this author was, and that is Fondly with the trilogy of the Greenbone saga. However, I read Untethered Sky, which is a shorter story by her, and I was not feeling it at the same time. Yes, I was able to see those elements that made this story so good, which were like, we can feel the emotions of our characters, but it didn't land in the same way. And that's what also made me hesitant to add Fondly into my top 10 list, although for sure this story belongs to my favorites. And the last author here, it's an absolute plot twist for me, because the first time that I read his work, I was like, meh, this is not for me. And I was for a lot of time like, this is actually, overhyped. I don't understand how people are enjoying this. And I reread it and I was like, oh no, this is amazing. And it's actually me. Like, what was happening to past Izzet? His stories are smart, his characters witty, the plot is non-stop action. It has a lot of elements. It really made me reflect about the consequences of our acts, and that is Scott Lynch and the Gentleman Bastard series. I will continue reading his works, and perhaps he will become one of my favorite authors as well. And starting with the top 10, we will start strong with an author that has such a gift of creating stories that feel emotional, feel humorous, and also feel transcendent in a way in which there's always a point that feels heavy, but is dealt in a tone that feels almost really lighthearted. And the work of his author also allows me to restore faith in humanity, and that is DJ Clune. The first story that I read from him was actually his young adult trilogies, which leaned more towards the fantasy, romance almost side, and it had an amazing amount of magic. And what really surprised me, it was the depth of the characters and how really nuanced and how really fleshed out they felt. They felt like real people, like I was knowing them. My favorite book, and also the one that I consider is the best to start with him, remains the same, which is The House in the Cerulean Sea. And I think it's the perfect story in order to understand him, because it has such a good blend of, you have a story that will have very charismatic characters, and at the same time you will see how they struggle, but in the best way. It is a story that feels like a warm hug, and it made me cry happy tears. It's that blend. That, in summary, is what you will get with DJ Clune. In position number 9, we have an author that stole my heart, also because she's able to create stories that feel emotional, that feel lighthearted, and that feel humorous, with a great world building and a dash of fantasy that always makes the story well crafted and well thought of. There's one point which is like, you're not at the top because of these, which is that her characters, although feel compelling, are not incredibly complex. It just, what can go with them. All of her characters are kind of grey, and all of her characters are kind of misfits, but there's no an incredible depth in how you feel about them. Like, there's no a lot of inner dialogue, and that is Deacon Fisher. I've read, if not all, almost all of her books, and whenever she publishes something, I will read it because it's instant success. I always know that I will enjoy her books. If you need a story that feels humorous but feels fantastical, my favorite and the one that I recommend you to start with, it is Nettle and Bone, because it has this dash of dark fantasy. It is a fairy tale-esque story with a wonderful world building. There's a quest. It is super easy to get into the story, but you feel that stakes are high. You get these different POVs. There's the humor, it is incredible. And starting from these, you will see that her stories can have a little bit more romance, a little bit more humor, a little bit more fantasy. So it will then be up to you to decide which is the story that you get from this point onward. Position number 8, we have an author that has created one of my favorite books of all time. The story shocked me to my core. I needed to read up till 3 a.m. in the morning in order to understand what was happening. It made me sob, cry uncontrollably, and it made me instantly get this book, make my husband read it, and push it to all of the people that I love in order for them to read it. And she is Emma Wang, and the best way to start with her is with The Sword of Kagan, which is an incredible standalone. This story, it's able to convey family drama with action scenes that rival Sanderson with elemental magic, or in other words, she's able to craft really good magic systems with dynamics that feel so well done. You see profoundly how the characters change. Her stories lean heavily towards the character-driven side, although it always keeps the plot promising. Her other standalone, Blood of a Bright Haven, also consolidates this. I love the magic system, the characters, the stakes, and our stories that I promise you will make you feel different. So whenever you want to change, just go and pick this one up. Position number 7, we have an author that is just plainly a genius. He is a master in making you feel in awe, entertained, and also a little bit dumb at the same time. Like, his stories are so good, not only because it is able to blend a lot of different characters and create stories that are massive in terms of scope, strategy, the consequences. It feels so difficult to do what he has done, but also the way in which the story is told, how it makes you reflect about things. It's just outstanding, and that is Ken Liu. The best way for me to start with him is with the Paper Menagerie, which is a combination of different stories, and it is a little bit of a blend of fantasy, sci-fi stories, and are really short, but it will very quickly allow you to see how his stories will profoundly change you. He takes themes such as hope, and it just brings it for us to discussion. My favorite stories from him are, however, the Dandelion Dynasty, which is a series that belongs also to my favorite fantasy series of all time, and I haven't even concluded this series, but I know it is so good. The amount of characters, of care, the way in which he changes from book 1, in which each chapter feels like a whole story, to book 2, in which you have a more cohesive but more complex and more character-driven story. It's mind-blowing. I love these. Whenever Ken Liu writes something, I know I'm gonna read it. I'm never ever disappointed. Position number 6, we have the King of Humor. And although I'm really early into my journey of discovering all of his works, I'm already in love, and I'm really able to see how masterfully this author crafts the stories and how he blends humor with also criticism for society and different topics of fantasy, really. And I'm talking about Terry Pratchett. I've read only 4 books within the Discworld series, which is massive, and I do recommend starting with Guards because it just displays incredibly how you will laugh out loud with the characters, but at the same time you will reflect. You will have these themes or tropes in fantasy, and you will see how those are twisted in a way. I am in awe. It's one of those authors that I instantly knew that he needed to be in the top 10 list, because you cannot miss him. It is an outstanding work. Position number 5, and I bet you're gonna be surprised also that this author is here, but I must confess that for all the sunshine that I am, I also like dark stories, and I love this author because although her stories always feel kind of like one way, you have this savage and dark elements beneath that always makes me reflect about the nature of monsters, of darkness, of magic, and I love how twisted her stories can be at times. Her works are not grimdark, but still you have that side, and I love it. In the Venn diagram of creating characters and plots that are amazing, she is like the perfect combination. And I'm talking about V. Schwab. My favorite book of her, it's not necessarily the one that I recommend you starting with. I adored The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which is a standalone, which you might think, oh, this is then perfect to start because, low commitment, but I think this is slightly slower than her usual works, and it is, yes, dark, but it leans more towards the romance side, I guess, than the other works that I absolutely adored from her as well. It just made me reflect about solitude, about fate. It made me feel empowered, and reading this book really made me want to go outside while it was raining and it was cold, and I needed time to think about stuff. However, I do recommend starting with The Darkest Shade of Magic, which will allow you to see a perhaps more fleshed out magic system where you will see this incredible world building where you have different Londons and there's a range of magic going back and forth, and our characters, are advancing through these worlds, and there's a lot going on. I think it is pretty entertaining, and you will be able to see that, this is kind of dark. I love how everything else is constructed, and I really recommend. Position number 4, we have the only sci-fi author here, and I love him with a burning passion because his stories are honestly out of this world. I've talked before of authors that have amazed me because how genius they seemed or how they're able to restore my faith in humanity. This author, however, feels like therapy for me. Like the way in which he writes allow me to cope with situations. Like it's able to trespass optimism and just this wittiness, and he is able to craft really hard sci-fi stories and make them really entertaining and easy for all of us, and that is Andy Weir. I read The Martian, Project Hail Mary, and also Artemis, and I do recommend starting with a story that is also my favorite, and that is Project Hail Mary. The reason why I would love you to start reading this story, it's because it has everything at its finest. You're able to see how our character will need to deal with a terrible situation. He is one day in space, he wakes up and he does not remember anything, and he's like, what is happening? Why am I here? Like, he copes with these really hard situations with optimism, and he does so in a way that feels inspiring. And after reading it, like, I was every time with a smile on my face. This story, it's incredible. And even Artemis, which it was pretty weak in my opinion, was able to convey that element of I'm always smiling while I'm reading this story, and I always want to read more because reading is fantastic. And yes, give me the books, I want to escape reality. In position number 3, we have an author that really knows how to make me suffer. She's really knowledgeable on how you can fall in love with her writing style while hating her characters, or how can you get into a story, feel completely invested, so invested that you feel the same anger, the same hatred as the main characters of the story. And that is R.F. Kuang, the author of both The Poppy War, Yellowface, and Babel. I will recommend you starting with Babel because in one hand is a standalone, which perhaps is a little bit low commitment, but also because it feels, and it is in my opinion, a masterpiece. The way in which she conveys dark academia at its finest with really complex themes. It's her trademark. You will see colonialism, and you will see language, and you will see sexism, and this is a theme that will be replicated in The Poppy War, and it is tackled here in a way that feels transcendental, and I loved reading this. I learned she is very well researched. Her stories always make you reflect on reality, on society, on history, and what has happened and what is to come. Position number 2, we have an author that is a gardener. He starts with an idea of a story, and he allows his characters and the plot to evolve, and he allows himself to go one way or another in order to see how the story will unfold. He has created one of also my favorite unconcluded series of all time, and I love him because he's able to create a world that feels incredibly fleshed out and allow us to see characters that are grey, and the stakes are so high because you know that characters can die. And although this is something that it's no strange for us in fantasy, the way in which this author writes, it is like you will be emotionally kidnapped with everything that happens. And I'm talking about George R.R. Martin, and I will recommend you start with A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a lot of other stories that you can read from him, and actually the first story that I read from him, it was a sci-fi story that leaned more towards the actual romance side, which feels kind of like nuts if you think about that. I also love the Forever Dream, which leans more towards the paranormal fantasy side. Song of Ice and Fire is a jewel of the crown because of how incredibly detailed and layered his stories are, how you really see how you can keep a story that feels incredibly character driven with a very strategic and on point, and the scenes that are savage, and my heart was taken out from me. And in position number 1, my favorite author, it's an architect. He is known because he's able to play out these stories from the beginning, and he knows where he wants to take his stories, which makes it for a very interesting read because he tends to foreshadow stuff. He adds a lot of seeds into the stories, which when you reread them, you are like, oh my god, this happened, and that is so mind-blowing. I love this author, however, not only because of how incredibly epic his stories are, but because he's also amazing with the fandom. And yes, I'm talking about Brandon Sanderson. The book that I will recommend you to start with him, it's not necessarily the one that it's the easiest in order to fall in love with him. It's probably Tres of the Emerald Sea, which is kind of like a Princess Bride retelling with the twist, and it is cozy, it is humorous, it is plot driven, and it is really charming. It is really easy. It has this humor as well, but rather Mistborn, because it has this incredibly well crafted heart magic system, which is a trademark for the author, and it also allows you to see different POVs. You see, where his stories are going. It will allow you to see the sheer epicness and how the stories grow. Book 1, it's usually like, this is the premise and amazing things will happen, and then book 2 tends to be like tenfold more epic, and book 3 as well. Like, it always goes to epic proportions, and I love it. However, my favorite series of the author, it's the Stormlight Archive, which I am rereading, and I really recommend you reading it. I am in love with the story. Like, it is so amazing. There's a common vibe in the community, which is that Sanderson really writes easy fantasy, and although I agree that his prose, it is very accessible, the more I read Stormlight, the more I find that he has a lot of different layers, and that you find slightly different things whenever you read stuff time and time again. Like, yes, it's very cinematic, but there's also this really well thought stories, and it is not as easy as it feels, but at the same time it's so easy to get into the story, to feel in love, to feel lost, that I cannot recommend you more getting into this author. And if you like this content so far, consider joining my Patreon. We are currently reading Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. We also have the Wheel of Time read along, we have reading sprints, we have cozy games. There's a lot going on, and I would love to involve you and welcome you to our cozy community. And if you want to see which are my favorite books of all time, I will leave you here a video in which you can see, because they're books from authors that are not here, that are within my top list.